Hey guys, this is Andrew with Curious Tech. Just bringing a quick video today on overclocking your CPU. And this is really meant for beginners and people that have never overclocked before or are afraid to overclock, because this is a very simple software tool I'm going to show you that will safely overclock your CPU. So the software that we're actually going to be using to do the overclocking is Ryzen Master. And this is used to overclock any kind of AMD Ryzen CPUs. It's going to be very easy software to use that, what I'm going to show you today is going to leave you without anything to worry about when it comes to overpowering your CPU or overclocking it too far. That is not going to happen. We're just going to use the auto overclock feature that Ryzen Master has and see what the performance gains are and why it's worth doing so. Because this is untapped performance. You've paid for your CPU, and why wouldn't you want it to run as fast as it can? Again, auto overclock won't be the fastest it can run at. You can actually fine tune it and probably get it to run a little bit faster yourself, but this is the safest way without having to worry about any kind of damage. So we are going to use Ryzen Master. The other software tool, which I've mentioned in a previous video, is CPU ID Hardware Monitor. This is going to help us monitor the CPU temps and also to see just how fast the cores are going, how many megahertz we're running at. And Cinebench is the actual software we're going to use to do any kind of testing with. So we're going to first run Cinebench with the CPU at its default settings to see what kind of score we get and compare that with the auto overclock feature with Ryzen Master. So I already have everything loaded. We are at default overclock settings, so the CPU is right out of the box right now. The only other changes I would say that I've done that you guys may recognize is that I've actually overclocked the RAM that I have to 3600 megahertz, and with the Ryzen CPU it is important to do so, or to have fast RAM. It does tend to just run together easier without any kind of issues. So nonetheless, let's go ahead and start this. And we're doing a multi-core test so we can test all the cores. But as this is running, one thing I always kind of pay attention to also is what the max temperature that we get out of the CPU will end up being. Right now, 63 degrees, almost 64, yeah, we got 64 degrees Celsius there. And you're gonna notice when overclocking, anytime you overclock, temperatures are going to increase because you are actually providing, well, you're allowing the CPU to draw more power. Therefore, the more power you use, the hotter it's going to be, just natural physics. And now that this first test is done, we got a score of 21,268. And our maximum temperature that we got was 65 degrees Celsius. And the maximum megahertz that we did hit, looks like we actually hit 4950 as a maximum megahertz. And now what we'll do is we're going to actually overclock the CPU. And what that's going to require is just going to Ryzen Master here, clicking the Auto OC button, and then go ahead and hit apply. And this is going to require the computer to shut down and restart. And the reason being is Ryzen Master is just software that is changing how the CPU works in the BIOS. So when you typically overclock, you're going to go into the BIOS and change settings. That's kind of like the original way of overclocking a CPU. Just Ryzen Master has made it a little bit easier for the average consumer, and being able to use a good interface software like Ryzen Master, you're able to overclock without any kind of worries or wondering if you've caused any issues. And it's also easier to revert back to stock settings with this software as well. Okay, so we'll go ahead and let this all open up again. Ryzen Master should open up on its own. Probably gonna have to open up Hardware Monitor and Cinebench here. So I said it was 65 degrees earlier was where our CPU got. Cinebench opened. So now that we have all the settings set up to do to run Cinebench with auto overclock engaged on Ryzen Master, the things I want to look at is the maximum megahertz that we're going to see now should be around 5050. And we're also going to notice a pretty or a much higher temperature rating. Before we were at like 65 degrees Celsius, I predict that we're going to go quite a bit higher with this simple overclock. It's just because it's drawing more power, and simple physics, the more power you draw, the hotter things are going to be. And it also requires you having good cooling. And the cooling that I have for the CPU is I do actually have a Lee all-in-one water cooler. That really does help when it comes to overclocking. But even if you have a good air cooling system or good air cooler on the CPU itself, you should still be able to do this simple overclock. And that's also where you'll see the maximum temperature is 90 degrees. If for some reason we were to get to 90 degrees or above, the CPU is going to thermal throttle. It's going to draw less power and therefore keep its temperature from going above 90°C. And that's another safety feature for you as an overclocker. If you're overclocking, that's going to help keep your CPU from drawing too much power, getting too hot, and damaging itself. So let's go ahead and run this with multi-core test again on Cinebench, and we'll see what our results are after doing a simple overclock. As this is running, you can see our temperatures, we're already up towards 84 degrees Celsius. So we're almost 20 degrees Celsius hotter with the overclock. And that may seem dramatic, but your CPU is normally not always running at full throttle like it is during this test. And you got to keep that in mind. Right now, I mean, we were able to reach the 5050 megahertz as suggested with the maximum clock speed through Ryzen Master. So we definitely hit that. And we just got to keep in mind, see, now we're all the way back to idle. As soon as the test was done, we dropped immediately down into the 30 degrees Celsius. So don't think that just because you overclock, you're now going to be running at much hotter temperatures 24/7 when the computer's on. It's only when it's being utilized. But when you are gaming or doing some kind of productivity work, for those short bursts of power, this overclock really will make the difference. And as you can see, our score is much higher too. We now have a score of 22,465. And that is right there within the 3 to 5% increase that I predicted that we'd get from overclock. So with that said, guys, I suggest that you should definitely download Ryzen Master and use it if you have a Ryzen CPU so you can get as much performance as you can out of it. It just requires some decent cooling, which most of us should be using if we're even considering overclocking. But this is untapped potential or performance, and I do recommend doing so if you want to get the most bang for your buck. Anyways, thanks for watching the video today, guys, and if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below and I'll get back. Thanks.